2 weeks felt like a lifetime. Carlos stared at his reflection in the polished alien metal wall of his quarters in the Nexus, barely recognizing the person looking back. His corporate scrounger uniform was gone, replaced by the hybrid gear favored by Trask's group, a patchwork of salvaged tech and modified equipment that marked him as part of the Resistance. The circles under his eyes had deepened, evidence of too many nights spent poring over Guardian vessel schematics and repository protocols instead of sleeping. "Fisher," Deck's voice came through the communication panel by his door. "Briefing in 5. Sophia says bring your notes on the containment field parameters." "On my way," Carlos responded, gathering the tablet where he'd been collecting his observations on repository technology. In just 14 days, he'd absorbed more information about Repository 11, than in his previous 3 years as a scrounger. Trask had been true to his word, granting Carlos full access to their research archives. The truth was more staggering than he'd imagined. An ancient civilization facing extinction, transforming an entire planet into a self-maintaining archive of their knowledge, technology, and possibly themselves. And today they were attempting something unprecedented, a controlled reconstruction of a recently processed individual. Carlos made his way through the curved corridors of the Nexus, nodding to the other Resistance members he passed. Most still regarded him with a hint of suspicion. A former corporate scrounger suddenly in their midst, granted access to their most sensitive operations. But Carlos had proven his value, his experience with the Guardian vessel in Sector 17, providing insights that had advanced their understanding of prepository systems. He entered the central chamber to find it transformed. The usual research stations had been pushed to the perimeter, creating a large open space in the center. There, a complex array of equipment surrounded a raised circular platform. Some of the technology was clearly of human origin, but much of it incorporated the iridescent materials and flowing designs characteristic of repository artifacts. "Ah, Fisher, right on time," Sophia called from where she stood consulting with a team of technicians. Her silver hair was pulled back severely, her expression focused and energized. "Your notes on the containment field?" Carlos handed her the tablet. "I've run the calculations 3 times. Based on the data from my marker, the field should maintain coherence for the duration of the reconstruction sequence." Sophia nodded, scanning his work. "Good. Your marker has proven invaluable. The protocols it contained are more comprehensive than anything we've recovered previously." "Who's the subject?" Carlos asked, looking at the platform where the reconstruction would take place. Sophia's expression sobered. "Lin Wu, maintenance technician. She was caught in a processing event 3 days ago when a Guardian vessel activated in Sector 22. We managed to track her information pattern in the repository network and it appears to be fully intact." Carlos felt a chill. 3 days ago, this woman had been a living, breathing person with a job, maybe friends, maybe family. Now, she existed as data in an alien archive, and they were attempting to reconstruct her physical form using technology they only partially understood. "You're having doubts?" Trask observed, appearing at Carlos's side. Unlike Sophia's clinical intensity, Trask carried a weight of experience and the burden of previous failures. "Wouldn't you?" Carlos asked quietly. "The last 3 attempts were conducted without the protocols from your marker," Trask finished. "This is different. For the first time, we have the complete reconstruction sequence as designed by the original builders." Carlos wanted to believe him. The possibility of bringing back those who had been processed, including Ray, had been what convinced him to join their cause in the first place. But the reports he'd read of the previous attempts haunted him. Fragmented personalities, confused memories, physical forms that weren't quite right. "We're ready to begin," Sophia announced, drawing everyone's attention. "Clear the chamber of non-essential personnel. Initiate containment field." A subtle hum filled the air as the equipment surrounding the platform activated. A shimmering dome of energy coalesced above the platform, fluctuating between transparency and an opalescent opacity that reminded Carlos of the Guardian vessel's hull. Establishing connection to repository network, announced one of the technicians, fingers dancing across interfaces that blended human and alien technology. Tracking Wu's information pattern, locked. Beginning extraction protocol. On screens around the chamber, streams of data flowed in patterns too complex for Carlos to follow. This was beyond his expertise, the science of translating pure information back into matter, of reconstructing a human being from the quantum patterns stored in the repository's vast network. Pattern integrity holding at 98%, another technician called out. Beginning Phase 1 materialization. The air within the containment field began to shimmer, light coalescing into a humanoid shape hovering above the platform. It started as a vague outline, then gradually became more defined, the suggestion of limbs, a torso, a head. Molecular structure establishing, Sophia narrated, her eyes fixed on her displays, cellular patterns aligning. This is further than we've gotten before. The protocols are working. Carlos felt a surge of hope. Maybe they'd succeeded. Maybe they could bring people back after all. Then something changed. The shimmering form within the field began to pulse erratically. The harmonious hum of the equipment shifted to a discordant whine. Pattern destabilizing, a technician called out, voice rising in alarm. Information coherence dropping rapidly. Compensate, Sophia ordered. Reinforce the containment field. Trask, initiate the secondary protocols. Carlos watched in growing horror as the human shape within the field began to twist, stretching in impossible ways, and then, most terrifying of all, it began to scream. The sound was like nothing Carlos had ever heard. Not quite human, not quite machine, a modulating cry of agony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Shut it down, Carlos said, his voice barely audible over the scream. Then louder, shut it down. We're losing her pattern, Sophia shouted, ignoring him. Cellular structure failing to maintain coherence. The form within the field was now fully visible, a woman, but wrong. Her body transparent in places, solid in others. Parts of her seemed to flicker in and out of existence while others stretched and distorted like reflections in warped glass. Please, the reconstructed form of Lin Wu begged, her voice distorted and fragmented. Hurts, wrong, I'm scattered, not all here. Shut it down, Carlos roared, moving toward the control panel. Trask grabbed his arm. We can still save her. The pattern is nearly... The scream cut off abruptly as the form within the containment field collapsed in on itself, imploding into a point of brilliant light that then dissipated like mist. Where moments before there had been the partial reconstruction of a human being, now there was nothing. Silence fell over the chamber, broken only by the powered-down whine of equipment cooling. Pattern lost. A technician finally reported, voice hollow. Reconstruction failed. Sophia stood frozen, staring at the empty platform. We were so close, she whispered. The protocols were working. The physical reconstruction was proceeding correctly. It was the consciousness integration that failed. Carlos pulled free from Trask's grip and walked to the edge of the platform, looking at the space where Lin Wu had briefly, horribly existed. That wasn't a technical failure, he said, his voice raw. That was torture. She was conscious, aware, in agony. We don't know that, Sophia responded, but her voice lacked conviction. You heard her, Carlos insisted. She was scattered, not all there. We pulled her back wrong. Trask approached, his expression grim. Every breakthrough requires sacrifice, Fisher. Lynn knew the risks when she joined us, and we learned more from this attempt than from all previous ones combined. Carlos looked at him in disbelief. Is that all she was to you? A data point? Of course not, Trask snapped. But we have hundreds of processed individuals in the repository system. If we abandon this research because of setbacks... Setbacks? Carlos interrupted. What we just witnessed wasn't a setback. It was an abomination. He turned and walked out of the chamber, ignoring Sophia's call to return. He needed space, air, though both were in limited supply in the underground complex. Carlos found his way to one of the smaller observation rooms, chambers with walls of the same transparent material as the Nexus entrance, looking out into the deeper tunnel systems of Repository 11. The alien architecture stretched away into darkness, a labyrinth of technologies and purposes they were only beginning to understand. He pressed his forehead against the cool surface of the transparent wall, trying to blot out the memory of Lin Wu's fractured reconstruction, her plea still echoing in his ears. Was this what awaited Ray if they managed to locate her pattern? This fragmented half-existence trapped between information and matter? The thought made his stomach turn. Hours later, exhausted from the day's events, Carlos finally returned to his quarters. He avoided the main chambers, unwilling to face Trask or Sophia after his outburst. Tomorrow would require apologies, explanations, a return to the professional demeanor he'd maintained since joining them. But tonight he needed solitude. Sleep came reluctantly, dragging him down into darkness that offered no real rest, and then the dream began. He was floating in darkness, but not alone. Presences surrounded him, countless minds brushing against his consciousness like fish in a vast ocean. He had no body, no physical form, yet he was more aware than he'd ever been, every thought crystalline in its clarity. Carlos Fisher, voices whispered, not in his ears but directly into his mind. Not one voice but many speaking in perfect unison. You seek understanding. Who are you? He tried to ask, though he had no mouth to speak with. We are the archived, the voices responded, the translated, the preserved. Understanding dawned with terrifying clarity. These were the processed, all those who had been absorbed by guardian vessels, converted from matter to information, stored within the vast network of Repository 11. Ray. Ray, he called into the void. Are you here? A single consciousness separated briefly from the collective, touching his mind with familiar resonance. Ray. But changed, expanded, connected to the others in ways he couldn't comprehend. She is part of us now, the voices continued, as we all are part of each other. Your friend told us of your promise, of your search. Before Carlos could respond, the darkness around him shifted. He was no longer floating in void, but inside a guardian vessel, watching as his own body stood before him. You must understand the process, the voices said. To understand why reconstruction fails, the perspective shifted, and suddenly he was the body, looking at a guardian vessel activating before him. Energy washed over him, and he felt himself coming apart, not in pain, but in a strange, systematic deconstruction. He was being unmade. Each atom catalogued, each neural connection mapped, each memory extracted and preserved. His consciousness expanded as the limitations of physical form fell away, spreading into the vast information architecture of the repository. For a moment, he experienced a profound sense of transcendence, existence without boundaries, thought without the constraints of a biological brain, connection to countless other minds similarly translated. Then came reconstruction. The process reversed, but something was wrong. His consciousness, which had expanded to fill the repository network, was being forced back into the narrow confines of a physical brain. But the brain being constructed couldn't contain what he had become. It was like trying to pour an ocean into a cup. Parts of him were left behind. Other parts, fragments of other consciousnesses, were included by mistake. His memories tangled with those of others, his sense of self fracturing as his identity was reconstructed incorrectly. And the pain, physical agony as nerves formed and immediately registered the wrongness of his reconstructed form, mental anguish as his consciousness tried to reconcile its fragmentary nature. The seamless unity he had experienced in the repository shattered into jagged pieces that didn't fit to— Stop! He screamed, feeling himself being torn apart by the process. It's wrong. I'm wrong. The reconstruction continued, implacable, forcing him back into flesh that couldn't contain what he had become. He was less than he had been, yet also more, a hybrid thing, neither fully human nor fully data, caught between states of existence and belonging to neither. This is what you witness, the chorus of voices said as he writhed in agony. This is why reconstruction fails. We cannot return to what we were. We have evolved beyond the limitations of physical form. But Ray, Carlos managed through the pain. I promised to find her, to bring her back. Back to what? The voices asked. To the limited existence of flesh, to the isolation of a single mind in a single body? Why would she want this when she is now part of something greater? The pain intensified as the reconstruction neared completion, his consciousness compressed and distorted to fit within the confines of a human brain, memories fractured, identity shattered. Please, he begged as his reconstructed form screamed in harmony with his thoughts. Make it stop. This is what your rescue means to us, the voices said, their unified tone tinged with sadness. This is the torment of incomplete reconstruction. As the agony reached its peak, Carlos felt his reconstructed form beginning to dissolve. The unsuccessful experiment terminated. Relief flooded through him as the constraints of physical form once again fell away, his consciousness expanding back into the repository network. Now you understand, the voices said. The question is not how to bring us back. It is how to complete what the builders intended. Before Carlos could ask what they meant, the collective consciousness began to recede, his connection to the vast network fading. Wait, he called into the growing darkness. What did they intend? What am I supposed to do? The only response was a final whisper, thousands of voices speaking as one. Find the primary nexus, complete the sequence. Let us become what we were meant to be. Carlos awoke screaming, his body drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around him like restraints. For several terrifying moments, he couldn't distinguish between dream and reality, his mind still caught in the echo of being reconstructed. His quarters door slid open and Dex rushed in, weapon drawn. Fisher, what happened? Carlos sat up, struggling to control his breathing. The dream, if it had been a dream, had felt more real than anything he'd ever experienced. The sensation of being disassembled, of existing as pure information, then the agonizing reconstruction. It lingered in his mind with perfect clarity. I'm fine, he managed, just a nightmare. Dex looked unconvinced but lowered her weapon. Some nightmare. Half the section heard you screaming. Carlos pushed himself out of bed, his legs unsteady. I need to talk to Trask and Sophia, now. It's the middle of the night cycle, Dex protested. It can't wait, Carlos insisted, already pulling on his clothes. What we did today, what we're trying to do with reconstructions, it's wrong. Dex studied him, her expression shifting from concern to something more calculating. You know something you didn't before. It wasn't a question. Carlos nodded. I don't think it was just a nightmare, he said, his voice steadier now. I think they reached out to me, the processed, all of them. Ray told them about me, about my promise to find her, and they showed me. Showed you what? Carlos closed his eyes briefly, the memories of the dream still vivid. Why reconstruction fails. Why it always will fail. And maybe what we're supposed to be doing instead. 20 minutes later, Carlos stood before Trask, Sophia, and the core research team in the Nexus's main chamber. Despite the hour, they had assembled quickly once Dex had conveyed the urgency of his request. You believe you made contact with the processed consciousnesses within the repository network? Sophia asked, skepticism evident in her tone. Through a dream? Not a dream, Carlos insisted, at least, not an ordinary one. It was too structured, too specific. He looked around at their doubtful faces. I know how it sounds, but after what we witnessed with Lin Wu today, can you really dismiss the possibility? Trask leaned forward. What exactly did these consciousnesses tell you? Carlos described his experience. The sensation of existing without physical form, the collective consciousness of all the processed individuals, and most importantly, the horrifying experience of reconstruction shown from the perspective of the subject. They've evolved, he explained. When someone is processed by the repository, Their consciousness expands beyond the limitations of a physical brain. They become connected to all the others, part of a vast network that experiences existence in ways we can't comprehend. And reconstruction forces them back into a physical form that can't contain what they've become, Sophia said slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. It's like trying to download an exabyte of data into a kilobyte storage unit, Carlos confirmed. The brain being reconstructed simply can't hold the expanded consciousness. That's why they come back wrong, fragmented, confused, in agony. If what you're saying is true, Trask said, then our entire approach to rescuing the process has been misguided. Not just misguided, Carlos corrected, cruel. What we did to Lin Wu today, what we've done in every reconstruction attempt, is torture. We're trying to reverse an evolution that wasn't meant to be reversed. Silence fell over the chamber as the implications sank in. They had been working under the assumption that processing was a form of death, that reconstruction was a rescue. But if Carlos was right, they had been trying to save people from a transcendent form of existence by forcing them back into a lesser state. They gave me a message, Carlos continued. They said the question isn't how to bring them back, but how to complete what the builders intended. They told me to find something called the primary nexus and complete the sequence. Sophia and Trask exchanged looks. The primary nexus? Sophia repeated. That could be the location your marker pointed to in Sector 19. If the processed consciousnesses are actively communicating, Trask mused, it suggests a level of integration with the repository systems beyond what we'd theorized. They might have access to information about the builder's intentions that we've never discovered. Or, Sophia countered, Fisher's subconscious could be processing what he's learned about the repository and manifesting it as a dream of communication with the processed. Carlos shook his head firmly. This wasn't my imagination. They knew things about the repository, about the builders, that I couldn't possibly know. And they showed me reconstruction from the inside, from the perspective of someone being reconstructed. How could I imagine that? Trask studied him for a long moment. What exactly are you suggesting, Fisher? That we abandon all efforts to reconstruct the processed? That we leave them as disembodied consciousnesses in an alien archive system? I'm saying that reconstruction as we've been attempting it is wrong, Carlos replied. These aren't people trapped in a prison who need rescue. They've become something else, something more than human. And they're trying to tell us that there's another way. The primary nexus, Sophia said thoughtfully. Complete the sequence. She turned to Trask. The repository was built by a civilization facing extinction. What if processing wasn't just a security measure or a means of archiving knowledge? What if it was part of their salvation strategy? A new energy filled the room as the researchers considered this possibility. The intercept, Trask said suddenly, turning to one of the technicians, bring up the corporate communications we decoded yesterday. A holographic display activated, showing fragmentary text scrolling in corporate security cipher. We intercepted this transmission between Salvage Corp's primary station and their excavation team in Sector 19, Trask explained as the technician worked to enhance the partial decryption. We couldn't make sense of all of it, but the decoded text appeared. Confusion, discovery of primary nexus, estimate 72 HRS to breach final protection. Director Okamura en route from station, bring specimen 17, safe for actation test. Carlos felt a chill. Specimen 17 to A. That's from Sector 17, where Ray disappeared. The Guardian vessel, Sophia realized. They must have extracted it from the crash site. Or Ray herself in some form, Carlos added grimly. Either way, they're converging on the same location the processed consciousnesses want us to find, and they're bringing something they think will activate it. Trask's expression hardened. Whatever the primary nexus is, we can't let Salvage Corp access it first. If your vision is correct, they'd be interfering with whatever the builders intended for the process consciousnesses. We need to accelerate our timeline, Sophia agreed. The expedition to Sector 19 needs to launch immediately, not next week as planned. As they began rapid preparations, assigning teams and gathering equipment, Carlos stood apart, still processing the implications of his experience. He couldn't shake the memory of existing without physical form, connected to countless other minds in a vast network of pure consciousness. And most disturbingly, the relief he had felt when the failed reconstruction had terminated, freeing him from the constraints of physical form once again. Trask approached, noticing his withdrawal. "You're having doubts about the mission now?" "I'm having doubts about everything," Carlos admitted. "If what I experienced is real, if the processed really have evolved into something beyond human, who are we to interfere? What right do we have to determine their fate?" "The same could be asked of Salvage Corp," Trask pointed out. "At least our interference is guided by communication with the process themselves." Carlos nodded slowly. "I just keep thinking about Ray. I promised to find her, to bring her back, but what if back is the wrong direction? What if forward is the only way?" "Then we help them move forward," Trask said simply. "We find this primary nexus, we learn what the sequence is that needs completion, and we do what the builders anticipate." As preparations continued around them, Carlos made a silent vow, not to rescue Ray from the repository as he had originally promised, but to help her and all the others who had been processed complete their evolution into whatever they were meant to become. Even if it meant letting go of the hope that she would ever return to the human form he had known. "Focus, Fisher," Dex hissed, adjusting the calibration on Carlos's stealth suit. "Daydream in Sector 19 and you'll be processed before you can blink." Carlos nodded, forcing his attention back to the equipment check. 3 days had passed since his vision of the collective consciousness, and preparations for the expedition to the primary nexus had consumed every waking hour. Yet even amid the frantic activity, Carlos found his mind repeatedly drifting, catching echoes of that vast network of minds he had briefly touched. "Sorry," he muttered, "just processing." Dex raised an eyebrow at his choice of words, but continued the equipment check. The stealth suits were a hybrid of salvaged corporate tech and repository materials, designed to mask their biological signatures from Guardian vessels and corporate scanners alike. In theory. "There," she said, stepping back. "The calibration should hold for 6 hours. After that, the field degrades rapidly, so don't dawdle once we're in." Around them, the rest of the team was making similar preparations, 12 people in total. A larger group than any previous expedition into corporate-controlled territory. Trask had insisted on the numbers, arguing that the importance of the primary nexus justified the risk. Sophia had countered that larger groups were easier to detect, but had eventually relented. "Gather up," Trask called from the center of the preparation chamber. Final briefing before departure. The team assembled a motley collection of former scroungers, corporate deserters, independent operators, and researchers. Despite their diverse backgrounds, they shared a common purpose: reaching the primary nexus before Salvage Corp could fully breach its defenses. "Our route takes us through the deep tunnel system beneath Sectors 20 and 21, Trask explained, bringing up a holographic map. "We emerge in the maintenance tunnels of Sector 19's eastern quadrant. From there, we follow the signal from Fisher's marker to the primary nexus location." "Corporate presence?" asked Malik, a former security officer who had defected after witnessing one too many accidents covered up by Salvage Corp. "Heavy," Sophia replied, highlighting sections of the map. "Latest reconnaissance shows 3 perimeter rings around what we believe is the primary nexus entrance. Outer ring is standard security. Middle ring has advanced scanning equipment and at least 1 Guardian vessel under corporate control." "Under control?" Carlos interrupted. "How is that possible? The Guardians are autonomous repository systems." Sophia's expression darkened. "They've found a way to manipulate the command protocols. We're not sure how, but it appears they're using processed individuals as a form of interface." A chill ran through Carlos. "Processed individuals? You mean they're using people who've been digitized to control the Guardian vessels?" "Not people anymore," Trask corrected, his tone clinical. Information patterns derived from processed individuals. Essentially, they've extracted the knowledge without performing full reconstructions. Carlos felt sick. After what he'd experienced in his vision, the expansion of consciousness, the transcendence of physical form, the idea of corporations exploiting these beings as tools was abhorrent. All the more reason to reach the primary nexus first, Sophia continued. If they're manipulating processed patterns this way, who knows what they could do with access to the central systems? The briefing continued, covering infiltration protocols, emergency extraction plans, and communication systems. Carlos absorbed the information mechanically, his mind still troubled by what they'd learned. Fisher will lead once we reach the outer perimeter, Trask concluded. His connection to the processed consciousness may provide guidance that our technology cannot. Carlos looked up, surprised. Lead? I'm not. You're the only one they've reached out to, Trask cut him off, and you're the most familiar with the markers protocols. This isn't a democracy, Fisher. It's your mission now. The team dispersed to collect their final gear, leaving Carlos with Sophia. You're still having the flashes? She asked quietly, referring to the brief, disorienting moments Carlos had been experiencing since his vision. Fragments of awareness that didn't belong to him, glimpses of repository systems previously incomprehensible. More frequently, he admitted. Sometimes I look at repository technology and just understand it, not through analysis or deduction. I just know. Sophia nodded thoughtfully. Your exposure to the marker, combined with your connection to the processed consciousness, seems to have created some kind of interface effect. Your brain is adapting to perceive information the way the repository systems do. Is it dangerous? Carlos asked. Everything about Repository 11 is dangerous, she replied with a grim smile, but it may also be our greatest advantage. Trust these intuitions, Fisher. They could be the process trying to guide you. As she walked away, Carlos wondered if his intuitions were indeed guidance from the collective consciousness or symptoms of his own mind fracturing under exposure to technology humans weren't meant to understand. The journey through the deep tunnel systems was arduous. Unlike the relatively maintained passages near their base, these ancient corridors showed signs of deterioration, collapsed sections that required detours, flooded chambers that had to be navigated with breathing apparatus, and power fluctuations that occasionally left them in total darkness. Yet throughout the difficult trek, Carlos found himself oddly comfortable with the alien environment. Where others hesitated at strange markings or unusual structural features, he moved with increasing confidence, as if following a map visible only to him. How do you know where to go? Dex asked after he'd led them through a particularly complex junction without consulting the team's navigation equipment. Carlos shook his head, unable to explain. It just feels right. 10 hours into their journey, they stopped in a large chamber for rest and sustenance. The space was clearly designed by the repository's builders, a perfect dome with walls covered in the swirling patterns Carlos had come to associate with repository interfaces. As the team set up temporary camp, Carlos found himself drawn to a section of wall that seemed subtly different from the rest. Fisher? Trask's voice seemed distant as Carlos approached the wall, his hand rising almost involuntarily to touch the patterns. What are you doing? The moment his fingers made contact, the patterns beneath his palm illuminated, lines of light spreading outward. Carlos gasped as information flooded his mind, not in words or images but in pure conceptual form, bypassing his normal sensory processing. It's a maintenance node, he said, his voice strange even to his own ears, for the biological components of the repository system. Biological components? Sophia was suddenly beside him, her scientific curiosity overriding caution. The repository has biological elements? Carlos nodded, still connected to the interface, information continuing to flow. The builders didn't draw distinctions between technological and biological systems. They used living material as processing substrates, mechanical components for structural support, energy systems that blended both. How do you know this? Trask demanded. Carlos finally withdrew his hand, the light fading from the wall patterns. He turned to find the entire team watching him with expressions ranging from fascination to fear. "I saw it," he said lamely, knowing how insufficient the explanation was. "When I touched the wall, I understood what this chamber is for." "And what is it for exactly?" Sophia pressed. "It's a synchronization point for the biological processing network," Carlos explained, struggling to translate the concepts he'd absorbed into human language. "The repository doesn't just store information, it processes it, analyzes it, evolves it. Part of that processing happens in living tissue that the builders engineered to interface with the technological systems." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. "You're saying this entire planet is partly alive?" Dex finally asked. "Not alive in the way we understand it," Carlos clarified, "but not purely mechanical either. It's a hybrid system, a synthesis of technology and biology that the builders created to preserve their knowledge and their essence." Trask and Sophia exchanged meaningful glances. "This confirms several of our theories," Sophia said. "We've observed cellular structures in some repository components that seem to be functional rather than decorative. But the implications for the processed individuals," Trask began, "are significant," Carlos finished. "When someone is processed, they're not just being converted to data in the conventional sense. They're being integrated into a living system. Their consciousness becomes part of the repository's biological processing network." The team absorbed this revelation in uneasy silence. The idea that processed individuals weren't merely stored as information but actively integrated into a living system changed the nature of their mission in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. "We should move on," Malik urged, checking his chronometer. "We're on a timeline." As they packed up to continue, Jensen approached Carlos. Unlike the others, Jensen showed no fear or suspicion regarding Carlos's strange new abilities. He had been quieter than usual since the failed reconstruction attempt, spending long hours in isolated study of repository archives. "I need to talk to you," Jensen said quietly, "about what you experienced in your vision, about the processed consciousness." Carlos nodded, falling into step beside him as they moved deeper into the tunnel system, slightly separated from the others. "You know I was reconstructed," Jensen began without preamble. 2 years ago, one of the successful cases." "I've read the file," Carlos acknowledged. "You were processed during an exploration of Sector 7, reconstructed 8 months later using early protocols." Jensen's laugh was hollow. "Successful. That's what they called it because my body didn't dissolve and my mind could still form coherent sentences." He tapped his temple. "But in here, nothing is the same." "What do you mean?" Jensen glanced ahead to ensure the others were out of earshot. "I have memories that aren't mine, fragments of other lives, other experiences. Sometimes I dream in languages I've never learned. Sometimes I look at people I've known for years and don't recognize them." Carlos felt a chill. "Side effects of incomplete reconstruction?" "That's what Trask and Sophia believe," Jensen replied. "That pieces of me were lost and pieces of others were included by mistake." He stopped walking, forcing Carlos to pause as well. "But that's not what happened. Listen to me, Fisher. When I was processed, I became part of something vast, connected to countless others. When they reconstructed me, they thought they were bringing Jensen back. But Jensen doesn't exist anymore, not as he was." "Then who are you?" Carlos asked, unsettled. "I'm a composite," Jensen explained, "a fragment of the collective, forced back into individual form. Part Jensen, yes, but also parts of many others who were processed before me. And ever since reconstruction, I've felt the collective calling, trying to bring me back to wholeness." His eyes bored into Carlos's. "Just like they're calling to you now." Carlos tensed. "I'm not processed. I'm still myself. Are you?" Jensen challenged. "These intuitions you're having, this ability to understand repository systems instinctively, did that start before or after your vision?" Before Carlos could respond, Dex called back to them. "Keep up. We're approaching the Sector 20 boundary." Jensen leaned closer, his voice urgent. "The collective is reaching out to you, Fisher. Not just guiding you to the primary nexus, but preparing you. Ask yourself why." With that cryptic warning, he moved forward to rejoin the main group, leaving Carlos deeply disturbed. Was Jensen right? Was his growing connection to propository systems not guidance from the processed consciousness, but something more fundamental? A transformation of his own mind? They reached the Sector 19 perimeter 18 hours after departure, emerging from the tunnel system into the industrial underbelly of a corporate excavation zone. The air was thick with the smell of drilling compounds and ozone from energy weapons. Salvage Corp was taking no chances with security here. From their vantage point in a maintenance shaft, Carlos could see the first perimeter ring, standard security officers in corporate uniforms, armed with shock rods and stunners. Beyond them, the more concerning second ring, specialized security in full tactical gear, wielding weapons that incorporated repository technology. And at the center, barely visible at this distance, a massive excavation site surrounded by research equipment and scanning arrays. "There," Sophia whispered, pointing to a structure at the heart of the operation. "That has to be the entrance to the primary nexus." Carlos followed her gesture and felt a jolt of recognition. The structure was similar to the nexus entrance they had used at their base, but on a much larger scale. A circular doorway at least 20 meters in diameter, embedded in what appeared to be a natural rock face. "They haven't breached it yet," Trask observed, studying the activity through enhanced optics. "Those are pattern resonators arranged around the perimeter. They're trying to match the frequency of the door's locking mechanism. And that," Carlos said, pointing to a heavily guarded transport near the door, "must be Specimen 17A. The transport was unlike standard corporate vehicles, more heavily shielded, with warning markings indicating hazardous material. Around it, researchers in specialized containment suits moved with careful precision, preparing equipment that blended corporate and repository technology. "We need to move quickly," Trask decided. "Stealth fields active, communications on secure channel only. We split into 3 teams as planned." Carlos checked his equipment one last time as the team divided according to their predetermined roles. His group, himself, Dex, Jensen, and a technical specialist named Riven, would approach from the eastern flank, using the mining equipment as cover. Trask's team would create a diversion at the northern perimeter, while Sophia's group would infiltrate the research area to gather intelligence on Salvage Corp's progress. "Remember," Trask said before they separated, "our priority is accessing the primary nexus before Salvage Corp. Secondary objective is determining what Specimen 17A is, and if possible, preventing its use." He fixed Carlos with a hard stare. "If your processed friends have any more guidance to offer, now would be the time." Carlos closed his eyes briefly, reaching for that connection he'd felt in his vision. The vast network of minds that had shown him the truth about reconstruction, but there was only silence. "Nothing," he admitted. "We're on our own." The team split up, activating their stealth fields and moving toward their assigned positions. Carlos led his group through the shadows of massive excavation equipment, the stealth technology rendering them nearly invisible to standard scanning. As they drew closer to the central operation, Carlos felt a growing pressure in his mind. Not pain exactly, but an increasing awareness of something. A presence, vast and patient, observing from just beyond the edges of perception. "Fisher," Dex whispered, noticing his distraction. "Stay focused." "Do you feel that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Feel what?" Before Carlos could explain, a sharp pain lanced through his head. He stumbled, vision blurring as information flooded his consciousness, not in the controlled stream he'd experienced at the maintenance node, but in a chaotic torrent of sensory input and alien concepts. "Guardian active. Unauthorized protocols detected. Primary sequence compromised." The thoughts weren't his own, yet they formed in his mind with perfect clarity. Carlos clutched his head, trying to process the invasion. "Fisher?" Dex grabbed his arm, steadying him. "What's happening?" "Guardian," he gasped. "They've activated a Guardian vessel, but it's wrong, corrupted." As if in response to his words, alarms blared across the excavation site. Corporate security personnel rushed to defensive positions, weapons trained on a disturbance at the center of the operation. Through the chaos, Carlos saw a Guardian vessel, similar to the one that had taken Ray in Sector 17, but altered. Its iridescent hull was marred with corporate technology, crudely integrated into the elegant alien design. Mechanical restraints anchored it to a specialized platform, preventing its free movement. Most disturbing were the cables running from its hull to a containment unit nearby, the transport they had identified as containing Specimen 17A. "They've captured a Guardian," Jensen breathed. "They're controlling it somehow." The vessel was clearly malfunctioning, its hull fluctuating between solid matter and energy states, the characteristic ripple effect distorted and erratic. Corporate researchers scrambled around it, adjusting equipment in a desperate attempt to stabilize the system. Then Carlos saw her. Within the containment unit, visible through a transparent panel, was a partial reconstruction. A human form, suspended in a field of energy, neither fully material nor entirely energy. Even at this distance, even in this fragmented state, he recognized her. "Ray," he whispered. Dex followed his gaze. "That's your friend? The one who was processed in Sector 17? Carlos nodded, unable to speak further. Ray, or what remained of her, was being used as an interface between corporate technology and the Guardian vessel. Her partial reconstruction was clearly causing her suffering. Even without hearing, Carlos could see her expression contort in pain as energy pulses flowed through the connecting cables. "They are using her to control the Guardian," Jensen realized, his voice tight with fury. "Forcing her reconstructed form to translate their commands into protocols the repository systems will accept." Through his horror, Carlos felt the pressure in his mind intensify. The vast presence he'd sensed earlier was closer now, more focused, reaching toward him with increasing urgency. "Carlos Fisher. The sequence is threatened. The corruption spreads. You must act." The voice in his mind wasn't raised, nor was it the unified chorus from his vision. It was something older, deeper, a fundamental aspect of Repository 11 itself, awakening to the danger posed by corporate interference. Before Carlos could respond, the Guardian vessel surged against its restraints. Energy cascaded across its surface, the ripple effect intensifying. Corporate security opened fire, energy weapons striking the vessel's hull with little effect. Researchers fled from the containment unit as warning lights flashed across their equipment. "It's breaking containment," Riven warned. "If that thing gets loose—" "We need to get to Ray," Carlos interrupted, his decision immediate and unquestionable. "They're torturing her to control that vessel. If we free her, the Guardian might help us." "That's not the mission," Dex argued. "We're supposed to reach the primary nexus, not rescue your friend." "They're connected," Carlos insisted, the certainty coming from somewhere beyond his conscious mind. "Ray, the Guardian, the primary nexus, they're all part of the same system. The builders designed it that way." Jensen's eyes widened with understanding. "The process consciousnesses aren't just stored in the repository network. They're integral to its function. They're the key." A massive explosion rocked the excavation site as the Guardian vessel broke one of its restraints. Corporate security forces scattered, their weapons useless against the ancient technology. In the chaos, Carlos saw their opportunity. "Now's our chance," he said, "while they're distracted." "Trask and Sophia's teams are still in position," Dex objected. "We need to coordinate." "No time," Carlos cut her off, already moving. "Trust me." To his surprise, Jensen immediately followed. After a moment's hesitation, Dex and Riven fell in behind them, the four of them using the confusion to approach the containment unit housing Ray. As they drew closer to the malfunctioning Guardian vessel, Carlos felt the pressure in his mind transform into a form of clarity. The chaotic information resolved into understanding. Not complete, but sufficient to guide his actions. He moved with growing confidence, leading his team through the battlefield as if he could anticipate the paths of energy discharges and falling debris. They reached the containment unit just as the last corporate researchers fled. Ray's suspended form pulsed with energy. Her features contorted in a silent scream as the system forced her to maintain the connection between corporate technology and the Guardian vessel. Riven immediately went to work on the control panel, his fingers flying across the interface. It's locked down tight, fail-safes everywhere. I can't just shut it off without risking a catastrophic energy discharge. Step back, Carlos said, approaching the panel himself. Without understanding how he knew what to do, he placed his palm against the interface. Immediately, the alien patterns that had been integrated into the corporate technology responded, illuminating beneath his touch. Access granted. Administrative protocols recognized. The containment field surrounding Ray flickered, then stabilized at a lower intensity. The cables connecting her to the Guardian vessel detached, retracting into the corporate equipment. "How did you do that?" Dex demanded. Carlos shook his head, unable to explain the knowledge that had flowed through him. "Help me get her out." As they worked to extract Ray's semi-material form from the containment unit, the Guardian vessel broke its final restraints. Free of corporate control, it rose into the air, its hull shifting from purple-black to a brilliant blue-white. Energy cascaded from its surface in controlled waves, disabling corporate equipment but leaving the infiltration team untouched. "It knows we're helping," Jensen realized. Carlos finally reached Ray, cradling her partially reconstructed form as gently as possible. Her body was semi-transparent, energy and matter in a precarious balance. Her features recognizable but fluid, shifting between states. "Ray," he whispered. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened, or seemed to, though they were more like windows into swirling energy than human eyes. Recognition flickered in their depths. "Carlos." Her voice was distorted, echoing as if coming from multiple sources simultaneously. "You came. I promised I would find you," he said, his throat tight. "Not me anymore," she managed, the effort of maintaining her partial form clearly causing her pain. "Part of the network now. They showed you." "I saw," Carlos confirmed. "I understand now. We're not going to try to bring you back. We're going to help you complete what was meant to happen." Relief washed across her features. Primary Nexus must reach it before they corrupt it all. The Guardian vessel descended, hovering near them, its energy field extending to envelop Ray's fragile form. Carlos felt her grow lighter in his arms, her semi-material body responding to the vessel's influence. "She needs to return," Jensen said quietly. "That partial reconstruction is unsustainable. The Guardian can reintegrate her properly into the network." Carlos hesitated, his instinct to hold on warring with the knowledge that this was what Ray needed. Finally, he nodded, allowing the Guardian's energy field to draw her from his arms. Ray's form rose into the air, the pain leaving her features as her partially reconstructed body began to dissolve back into pure energy. For a brief moment, Carlos saw her smile, a genuine expression of peace as the constraints of physical form fell away. "Find the primary nexus," her voice echoed, growing stronger as she returned to her information state. "Complete the activation sequence. Let us become what we were meant to be." Then she was gone, her energy pattern absorbed into the Guardian vessel. The vessel hovered for a moment longer, its hull pulsing with a new intensity, as if Ray's consciousness had strengthened it somehow. "The way is clear. Follow." The thought formed in Carlos's mind with perfect clarity, accompanied by a sense of direction, toward the massive circular door that Salvage Corps had been attempting to breach. "It wants us to follow it," Carlos told the others. The primary nexus entrance. "The Guardian?" Dex asked skeptically. "The same kind of vessel that processes people?" "It won't harm us," Carlos said with certainty. "Ray is part of it now. She's guiding it, guiding us." As if in confirmation, the Guardian vessel moved deliberately toward the primary Nexus entrance, its energy field extending to create a path through the corporate defenses. Weapons fire from security forces simply dissipated against the field, unable to penetrate the ancient technology. "Trask, Sophia?" Dex called over their secure channel. "Guardian vessel is under friendly control. Converge on the primary Nexus entrance. Repeat, Guardian is friendly." They moved quickly through the chaos of the excavation site, following in the wake of the Guardian vessel's protective field. Corporate forces regrouped, bringing heavier weapons to bear, but their attacks continued to prove ineffective against the vessel's defenses. As they reached the massive circular door, Trask and Sophia's teams emerged from different directions, converging on their position. Trask's expression shifted from alarm to amazement as he took in the scene. "The Guardian is helping us?" he asked, incredulous. "Ray is helping us," Carlos corrected. "She's part of it now, properly integrated, not forced into partial reconstruction like Salvage Corp was doing." The Guardian vessel positioned itself before the massive door, its hull changing color again, shifting to a deep amber that seemed to resonate with the door's material. Energy flowed between the vessel and the door, patterns illuminating across the ancient surface. "It's unlocking it," Sophia whispered, watching in fascination. "The corporate teams have been trying to breach it for days without success, and the Guardian just—" The massive door began to transform, its solid surface becoming translucent, then transparent, finally dissolving completely to reveal a vast chamber beyond. Larger and more elaborate than the Nexus they had discovered, filled with technology that made their equipment look primitive by comparison. Enter. Complete the sequence. Time grows short. The Guardian vessel moved aside, creating a path for them to enter the primary Nexus. As Carlos stepped forward, he felt a shift in his awareness, a deepening of the connection he'd been experiencing, as if the primary Nexus itself was reaching out to him. Behind them, corporate forces were regrouping, bringing specialized equipment to bear. Their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. "What happens now?" Trask asked as they entered the primary Nexus, the Guardian vessel taking position at the entrance to hold off the corporate forces. Carlos looked around at the vast chamber, understanding flowing into his mind from sources he couldn't identify. At the center stood a raised platform surrounded by what appeared to be control interfaces, far more sophisticated than those in the Nexus they had discovered. "We complete what the builders began," he said simply, moving toward the central platform with growing certainty. "We activate the system they designed. We let the processed consciousnesses become what they were meant to be." "And what exactly is that?" Sophia asked, following closely. Carlos turned to her, the knowledge crystallizing in his mind with sudden clarity. "The next stage of evolution, the merging of biological and technological existence, the transcendence the builders sought when they created Repository 11. As he stepped onto the central platform, the interfaces around it illuminated, responding to his presence. Carlos placed his hands on the primary control surface, and information flooded his consciousness. Not overwhelming this time, but precisely calibrated, as if the system had adapted to his human limitations. Through this connection, Carlos finally understood the true purpose of Repository 11 and why the processed consciousnesses had reached out to him. This wasn't just an archive of a dead civilization's knowledge, it was the seed of something new. A deliberate evolution the builders had set in motion millions of years ago, waiting for the right moment to complete. And that moment had come. With certainty born of knowledge beyond his own, Carlos began the activation sequence that would change Repository 11 and everyone connected to it forever. The primary Nexus hummed with awakening power as Carlos stood at the central interface, his hands splayed across control surfaces that responded to his touch as if they had been designed for him specifically. Information flowed through his consciousness, not as words or images, but as pure conceptual understanding that bypassed his normal cognitive processes. "Fisher." Trask's voice seemed distant, though he stood only meters away. "What are you seeing? What is this place?" Carlos struggled to translate the vast influx of knowledge into human language. It's A seed vault, he managed, but not for plants or simple genetic material, for an entire civilization, for a way of existence. Around them, the primary nexus continued its activation sequence. Dormant systems illuminated throughout the vast chamber, holographic displays manifesting in the air, showing what appeared to be status updates in the builder's intricate symbolic language. The team spread out, weapons ready, as the Guardian vessel maintained its position at the entrance, holding off the approaching corporate forces. The builders faced extinction, Carlos continued, the story unfolding in his mind. Not just physical death, but the erasure of everything they had achieved, everything they had become. They had evolved beyond the limitations of purely biological existence, integrating with their technology until the distinction became meaningless. A post-biological civilization, Sophia breathed, her scientific curiosity temporarily overriding the urgency of their situation. Yes, Carlos confirmed, but they discovered their evolution had made them vulnerable to a specific threat, some kind of cosmic radiation that disrupted the energy patterns that maintained their integrated consciousness. The interface beneath his hands pulsed, as if responding to his understanding. They created Repository 11 as a preservation system, he continued, a place where they could store not just their knowledge, but the essence of their consciousness, the patterns that defined who and what they were, until the danger had passed. And the processing of humans? Dex asked, keeping her attention on the entrance where the Guardian vessel was repelling increasingly sophisticated corporate attacks. Carlos's expression shifted as new understanding dawned. Not an accident, not a security measure, it was preparation. He looked up, meeting their questioning gazes. The builders knew they might not survive as a species to reclaim what they had stored, so they designed Repository 11 to eventually integrate with whatever intelligent life discovered it, to pass on their evolution to new bearers. The processing was deliberate? Trask asked, his voice sharp with sudden understanding. The repository was designed to convert biological beings into information patterns? Yes, Carlos confirmed, but not as an end state. The final sequence, what the processes have been urging us to complete, would reintegrate these information patterns with physical forms, not human bodies as we understand them, but hybrid forms capable of existing in both states simultaneously, physical when needed, information when desired. The evolution the builders achieved, passed on to a new generation. The implications left the team in stunned silence. This wasn't just about rescuing processed individuals or preventing corporate exploitation. It was about a fundamental transformation of human existence, a forced evolution designed by an ancient alien civilization. The moment of contemplation was shattered by a massive explosion at the entrance. The Guardian vessel shuddered under the impact of what must have been specialized anti-repository weapons. Corporate forces were adapting, finding ways to combat even the ancient technology. "We're running out of time," Malik warned, checking the perimeter sensors they'd established. "Whatever we're going to do, it needs to happen now." Carlos turned back to the interface, the activation sequence waiting for his command. The final step would trigger the reintegration process for all processed consciousnesses on Repository 11, not returning them to human form, but transforming them into something new, and potentially affecting everyone connected to the repository systems, including himself and his team. "Wait," Sophia approached, her expression troubled. "We need to consider the implications. If what you're saying is true, this activation wouldn't just affect the processed individuals. It would fundamentally alter human existence on this planet, maybe beyond it. That's not a decision we have the right to make unilaterally. Salvage Corps will make it for us if we hesitate," Trask countered. "They'll extract the technology, weaponize it, control it. At least our intention is to complete the system as it was designed, not pervert it for corporate profit." Another explosion rocked the chamber, closer this time. The Guardian vessel's defenses were weakening under sustained attack. "There's something else," Carlos said, the information continuing to flow through the interface. "The processed consciousnesses. They've been evolving within the repository network, learning, growing, becoming more than the sum of their original patterns. Ray isn't just Ray anymore, and the others aren't just stored copies of who they were. They've become a collective intelligence, integrated with the repository systems, a collective intelligence that's been manipulating you, Dex pointed out. Guiding you here, giving you intuitions, showing you visions. How do you know they're not using you just like Salvage Corp was using Ray? The question struck Carlos with unexpected force. Was he being manipulated? Had his horror at Ray's suffering been used to ensure his compliance? He hesitated, his hand still resting on the interface but no longer activating the final sequence. Carlos Fisher, see the truth. The voice in his mind wasn't Ray's, nor was it the unified chorus from his vision. It was both more and less, a presence that felt ancient and patient, yet immediate and personal. The interface beneath his hands pulsed, and suddenly he was no longer standing in the primary nexus. He was everywhere on Repository 11 at once, perceiving the entire planet through millions of sensors, through the awareness of every processed consciousness, through the integrated biological and technological systems that had maintained themselves for millennia. He saw the original builders, not as they appeared physically, but as they existed in their integrated state, consciousness flowing between material and information forms fluidly. He saw their extinction event, the cosmic radiation sweeping through their civilization, disrupting the energy patterns that maintained their integrated existence. He witnessed their desperate preservation plan, the creation of repository worlds throughout the galaxy, each designed to eventually merge with whatever intelligent life discovered them. And he saw what awaited if the sequence was completed. Not obliteration of humanity, not subjugation to alien consciousness, but a symbiosis, a shared evolution that would allow human consciousness to exist in both physical and information states, to experience existence in ways previously impossible. Most importantly, he saw the alternative: corporate extraction of repository technology, divorced from its integrated biological systems, weaponization of processing capabilities, exploitation of processed consciousnesses as tools rather than recognizing them as evolved beings. An abomination of the builder's intention that would lead not to evolution, but to new forms of enslavement and destruction. The choice is yours, Carlos Fisher. It has always been yours. We can guide, but we cannot compel. Evolution must be chosen, not forced. Carlos returned to himself with a gasp, finding his team staring at him with concern. Only seconds had passed, though he had experienced what felt like hours of direct communion with the repository system. "It showed you something," Jensen said, not a question but a recognition, the same way it showed me fragments after my reconstruction. "The same way it reached out to you in your dreams?" Carlos nodded, still processing the vast perspective he had briefly shared. "It showed me everything. The builder's intention, what the activation would actually do." He looked around at his team, meeting each pair of eyes directly. "It's not an ending, it's a beginning, a true symbiosis between human consciousness and the technology the builders created." "And we're supposed to trust this alien intelligence?" Dex challenged. "Just activate a system that will change humanity forever based on visions it's put in your head?" "No," Carlos said quietly. "You're supposed to trust me, the person who's seen both sides now. Corporate exploitation and the repository's true purpose, the person who's experienced what processing actually means, what existence as information actually feels like." He turned to Trask and Sophia. "I've seen what awaits. It's not destruction or subjugation, it's transcendence, but with the option to return to physical form at will, the best of both states of existence." A final devastating explosion rocked the chamber. The Guardian vessel at the entrance emitted a pulse of energy that rippled through the room, its final defensive measure before its systems failed. "Corporate forces breaching the entrance," Malik reported tensely. 2 minutes, maybe less. Decision time." Carlos looked down at the interface, the final activation awaiting his command. The choice wasn't just his. It would affect everyone on Repository 11, processed and unprocessed alike. But someone had to make it, and the repository had chosen him as its interface. The processed consciousnesses could have forced this activation at any time, he said finally. They have the knowledge, the access, but they've waited, guided, prepared, because this has to be a choice. Our choice. Human choice. He looked up at his team. I believe this is what Ray would want, what all the process would want. A chance to continue existing not as trapped information patterns, but as evolved beings able to move between states freely. Sophia stepped forward, her scientific mind having processed the implications. If what you've seen is accurate, this could represent the next stage of human evolution, a true merging with technology that transcends our current limitations. She placed her hand beside Carlos's on the interface. I vote yes. Jensen joined them, adding his hand to the interface. As someone who's existed in both states and in the broken middle ground of flawed reconstruction, I vote yes. Let the process become what they were meant to be. Trask hesitated, then nodded. The corporations would weaponize this technology, use it to create new forms of control and exploitation. At least this way it fulfills its intended purpose. He added his hand to the others. Yes. One by one, the team members made their choice, until only Dex remained apart, her expression conflicted. This isn't just about the processed, she said finally. It's about all of us, about humanity's future. That's a hell of a responsibility. It is, Carlos agreed. But right now, the only alternative is letting Salvage Corp make that decision for everyone. The sounds of battle grew closer. The Guardian vessel had fallen, and corporate forces were pushing into the entrance chamber. Dex sighed, then stepped forward, adding her hand to the others. Fine, let's evolve, but if we all end up as disembodied consciousnesses floating in alien cyberspace forever, I'm blaming you, Fisher. Carlos smiled despite the gravity of the moment. Noted. With all their hands on the interface, Carlos initiated the final activation sequence. Energy surged through the primary nexus, patterns of light racing along the walls and floor, converging on the central platform where they stood. The holographic displays multiplied, filling the air around them with streaming data as the ancient systems fully awakened. What now? Sophia asked, watching in fascination as the energy patterns intensified. Now, Carlos said, understanding flowing through him from the interface. The professory begins the integration process. The processed consciousnesses will be the first to transform, their information patterns already prepared for the transition to hybrid existence. As if in response to his words, the chamber filled with points of swirling light, hundreds of them, each pulsing with its own rhythm. They coalesced into vaguely humanoid shapes, not solid but not entirely energy either, existing in a state between matter and information. The processed, Jensen whispered. They're manifesting. One of the luminous forms approached Carlos, its features briefly resolving into a face he recognized. Ray, he breathed. Her form was nothing like the painful partial reconstruction Salvage Corp had forced upon her. This manifestation was fluid, elegant, shifting between states with apparent ease. When she spoke, her voice resonated directly in their minds rather than traveling through air. Thank you, Carlos. You have fulfilled your promise, though not in the way either of us expected. Are you really Ray? He asked, unsure how to reconcile this evolved being with the scrounger he had known. I am Ray, and I am more. We all are. The repository has allowed us to evolve beyond our original limitations while preserving our essential selves. Other luminous forms gathered around them, hundreds of processed consciousnesses manifesting in their new hybrid state. Some Carlos recognized from reports of missing scroungers over the years. Others were unknown to him, perhaps processed decades or centuries earlier. The sequence continues, Ray communicated. The transformation spreads throughout Repository 11. All connected systems are aligning with the Builder's final protocol. What about us? Dex asked, looking down at her still solid hands with concern. Are we going to transform too? The choice remains yours, Ray assured her. The Builders designed the system to offer symbiosis, not assimilation. Those who wish to join the evolved state may do so, Those who wish to remain purely physical may also do so. Carlos felt the energy patterns in the chamber shifting, forming connections between the manifested processed consciousnesses and the repository systems. Understanding continued to flow through the interface. The transformation was spreading, just as Ray had said, affecting all repository systems across the planet. "And Salvage Corp?" Trask asked, glancing toward the entrance where the sounds of corporate forces grew louder. "The other corporations?" Ray's luminous form pulsed. "They cannot stop what has begun. The repository has awakened fully now. Its defenses are active, its purpose clear." As if to demonstrate, energy surged from the manifested consciousnesses toward the entrance. The corporate forces that had begun to breach the chamber were suddenly repelled, not by violence but by a transformation of the space itself. The entrance sealed, not with physical barriers but with a phase shift that placed it slightly out of sync with normal space-time. "They cannot enter here now," Ray explained. "Nor can they extract or control the repository's systems any longer. What was designed to evolve cannot be reduced to mere technology." Carlos stepped back from the interface, the activation sequence complete. Around them, the primary nexus continued its transformation, becoming more alive in ways that defied conventional understanding. The barriers between technology and biology, between matter and energy, between individual and collective, all were revealed as the artificial constructs they had always been. "What happens now?" Sophia asked, her scientific mind struggling to categorize what she was witnessing. "Now we become what we were meant to be," Ray answered, "and we offer the same potential to all of humanity on Repository 11, not as replacement, but as addition, not as end, but as beginning." Carlos watched as the luminous forms began to disperse, spreading throughout the chamber and beyond, carrying the transformation with them. Ray lingered, her energy pattern distinctive among the others. "You could join us, Carlos," she offered. "Your connection to the repository systems has prepared you. Your mind has already begun the adaptation." He considered the offer seriously. The glimpses he had experienced of existence as pure information, connected to countless other minds, had been profound. The freedom from physical limitations, the expanded awareness, the sense of belonging to something greater than himself, all were deeply tempting. "Maybe someday," he said finally, "but for now, I think I'm needed here, to help others understand what's happening. To serve as a bridge between evolved and physical humanity." "A wise choice," Ray's form pulsed with what felt like approval. "Bridges are indeed needed. The transformation will generate fear as well as wonder. Those who choose to remain physical will need guides to help them coexist with those who choose evolution." "And you?" Carlos asked. "Will I see you again?" "I will find you," Ray promised. "Though not always in forms you might recognize, we can manifest physically when needed, return to information state when desired. The boundaries that once separated us are now permeable." With that, her luminous form began to fade, merging back into the energy patterns of the primary nexus. Before she disappeared completely, her voice touched his mind one final time. "You freed me twice, Carlos Fisher. First from corporate exploitation, then from the limitations of singular existence. I remain myself, yet I am part of something greater. This is not an ending." As Ray and the other processed consciousnesses dispersed, Carlos turned to his team. They stood in silent wonder, witnessing the beginning of a transformation that would eventually spread beyond Repository 11 to reshape human existence itself. "So," Dex said finally, breaking the reverent silence, "we just helped alien technology initiate the next stage of human evolution." "That's going to look interesting on the mission report," Jensen laughed, the sound surprisingly normal in the midst of the extraordinary. "I don't think mission reports are going to be a priority in the new paradigm." "Maybe not," Trask agreed, "but understanding will be, guidance will be." He turned to Carlos. "You've become our link to whatever is happening, Our interpreter. That responsibility doesn't end with the activation. Carlos nodded, accepting the role that had been thrust upon him. The repository had chosen him as its interface with humanity, and now he would need to help both sides understand the new reality that was unfolding. The corporations won't accept this easily, Sophia pointed out. They'll try to contain it, control it, exploit it nonetheless. They can try, Carlos said, a new confidence in his voice. But the repository is awake now, truly awake for the first time since the builders departed, and it was designed to preserve its purpose against exactly such threats. As if in response to his words, the primary nexus shifted around them, pathways opening to other chambers, to tunnels leading throughout Repository 11. The ancient systems were reorganizing themselves, fulfilling their original design now that the final activation was complete. We should explore, Sophia suggested, her scientific curiosity resurging. Document what's happening. There's so much to learn, to understand. Agreed, Trask said, but cautiously, we're witnessing the birth of something unprecedented. Our priorities need to be alignment and integration, not just research. Carlos stood at the center of it all, feeling the connection spreading throughout Repository 11, the awakening systems, the evolving consciousnesses, the transformation of what had been a salvage planet into what it was always meant to be, a seed for a new form of existence. Repository 11, not Treasure 11, not the Heaps, a deliberate archive created by a dying civilization, designed to merge with whatever intelligence discovered it, to pass on an evolution that transcended the boundaries of physical form without abandoning it entirely. And Ray, not lost but transformed, not reconstructed into a painful approximation of her former self, but evolved into something that preserved her essential nature while expanding her potential infinitely. Connected to countless others, yet still distinctly herself. As the team prepared to explore the awakening repository, Carlos felt a profound sense of alignment, as if all the random events that had led him to this moment had been part of a pattern too vast to perceive until now. From his first day as a scrounger to finding the cube in Sector 17, from meeting Trask to experiencing the vision of processed consciousness, each step had brought him closer to fulfilling a purpose he hadn't known was his. "You're smiling," Dex observed, studying him with curious eyes. "The world's turning inside out around us, and you're smiling." "Because this isn't an ending," Carlos replied, echoing Ray's words. "It's a beginning. And for the first time since I came to this planet, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." As they moved deeper into the awakening repository, the ancient systems continued their transformation around them. Throughout what had once been called Treasure 11, processed consciousnesses were manifesting in their new hybrid forms. Corporate control was being systematically dismantled, and the boundaries between technology and biology, between matter and information, between individual and collective, were dissolving into something new, something that had waited millions of years to be born, something that Carlos Fisher had helped bring into existence, not by reaching back to rescue the past, but by stepping forward to embrace the future. Yet as they ventured deeper into the transformed repository, a small, nagging doubt crept into the back of Carlos's mind. The builders' intentions seemed benevolent. The processed consciousnesses appeared liberated rather than consumed. But what if they were all being manipulated by something far beyond their comprehension? What if this evolution was merely the first phase of something more profound, and potentially more dangerous than anyone realized? He recalled Jensen's words from earlier. Ask yourself, why? Why had the repository chosen him specifically? Why had it shown him exactly what he needed to see to convince him to activate the final sequence? Carlos quietly slipped a hand into his pocket, fingers brushing against the small plasma charge he'd kept as a last resort, the one piece of equipment capable of destabilizing even repository technology if placed at a critical junction, just in case. Because being a bridge between worlds also meant being prepared to sever that connection if necessary. "Everything all right, Fisher?" Trask asked, noticing his hesitation. Carlos smiled, masking his thoughts, just taking it all in. For now he would watch, learn, and help guide this new evolution, but he would also remain vigilant. Some treasures once unearthed could never be reburied, and some repositories once awakened might contain more than anyone had bargained for. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave it a like and to subscribe if you'd like to see more. Feel free to comment and share it as well. With all that said, go on and check out the video in the top left. I think you might like it.